Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk called Debating Love in the Underworld, How Lore Olympus Explores Relationships in the Persephone Myth. Before I begin, I want to provide a content warning that this talk contains mention of rape, sexual violence, and abusive relationships. Our modern-day world knows Persephone myth well. The goddess of spring was kidnapped by the king of the dead. She became queen of the underworld for half the year, and her return to her mother and earth resulted in the renewal of spring. To many audiences, the myth is simple. It's an ideological story that explains the seasons. That scaled-down version of the myth lacks details of what actually happened to Persephone. She was abducted from her home, and as told in the ancient sources we have and many readings of them, she was raped by Hades. Arguments over the Persephone myth's modern-day reception focus on this distinct detail. Hades raped Persephone, and the myth is not and should not be told as a love story. But I want to focus on one specific retelling of Persephone's myth while looking at the debate of love in the underworld. Lore Olympus by Rachel Smythe. Lore Olympus is an online comic that publishes a new episode weekly on Webtoon. Smythe's first episode went live on March 3rd, 2018. The Lore Olympus storyline follows Persephone as a modern coming-of-age story as she navigates life and love amongst the gods. I argue that Lore Olympus successfully creates a retelling of the Persephone myth as a love story, but Smythe reconstructs the myth very carefully in order to do so. I want to start by discussing some reception studies theory, both generally and specific to the Persephone myth. Then I will work through 4 core character relationships within Lore Olympus that help create the Hades and Persephone love story without overlooking the trauma that Persephone faces in the ancient text, nor shortcutting the tale by fraying the bond between Demeter and Persephone. Overall, I hope to show that modern-day receptions of the Persephone myth are not harmful to our readings of the ancient myth. Rather, the similarities and differences in these new retellings help strengthen our understanding of Persephone's story. Let's start with a simple and complicated question. Why are receptions of the ancient myths important? To answer this question, we must turn to the subfield of reception studies. Within the Handbook for Classical Research compiled by David M. Shapps, the brief section for reception studies contains a multitude of key information. To quote the handbook, Hans Robert Jauss pioneered what he called reception aesthetics, the idea that every literary work, the idea has since been broadened to include performance and art as well, is written for a presumed audience and has its meaning only in terms of the way it is read by that audience or whatever other audience may come to read it. The classics do not merely instruct us, we negotiate with them, interpret them, and reinterpret them, appropriate them for our own purposes, and understand them in our own terms, end quote. In other words, the goal of receptions can be different than the goals of the so-called original text. The works exist separately, and they do not need to be exact copies. Receptions are often constructed with new goals that reflect the interpretations of their new audience. There are countless receptions about the myth of Persephone, and they usually fit into 2 general perspectives, Hades as the villain or Demeter as the villain. But we have to look deeper into why these 2 versions remain the most common, and why Lore Olympus stands all the stronger because it breaks out of this dualistic pattern of Persephone retellings. Marco K. Lewis's work on Persephone myth receptions remains integral to any study of how we look into the ancient and modern versions of Persephone's story. In her book, Persephone Rises, 1860 to 1927, Lewis examines Persephone receptions throughout that specific time period, showing different thematic approaches that authors use to manipulate the myth. Lewis explains her own work in the preface, stating that, quote, "At one level, this study may seem to record a confusion of warring voices and incompatible impulses, as each writer tries to tug the goddess, Persephone, in one direction or another, making her serve the writer's own agenda. At a deeper level, this is a tale of cultural changes reflected, and to some extent effected, through the controversies and literary creations explored here," end quote. In other words, We can see clearly that Persephone's myth has become many distinct stories while under the authority of different authors and writers. But we often miss the big picture. We end up losing our focus as we close in on the details of each retelling because we do not see how each of these retellings fits back together and calls back upon the ancient source texts from which the myth originated. That's what I love so much about Lore Olympus. We can simultaneously know that Persephone was taken unwillingly in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, and understand the complete inverse, where Persephone's mother tries to manipulate her into returning from her willing departure to the underworld by killing mortals, like in Emily Whitman's Radiant Darkness from 2009. The framework of Lore Olympus bridges the seemingly unclosable gap between ancient myth and modern retelling because Smythe avoids the simplistic Hades as villain or Demeter as villain dichotomy and focuses on Persephone. When the retelling centers on Persephone's own feelings and reactions, rather than following only what Hades or Demeter plan and execute during the story, we gain insights into how we can modernize the ancient myth without jeopardizing its content. But I want to focus not on how different receptions are from the ancient myth, but how these receptions are made even more worthwhile because of how we can compare them in conversation with the ancient sources. Ancient myths themselves vary. Take the very relevant example of the Homeric hymn to Demeter in conversation with Claudian's Seraptu Proserpinae, written about 1,000 years apart. Readers gain something from receptions that modify and modernize ancient texts. Nothing is lost from the distance between receptions and our so-called original source, because reception studies works to frame these gaps and changes in ways that offer fruitful ideas for conversation. For example, I formed the idea for this paper after talking with a colleague of mine who said that she dislikes modern retellings of the Persephone myth, like Lore Olympus, because they teach students to romanticize the relationship between Hades and Persephone. Since she brought up Lore Olympus, which she had never read before and I had, I started thinking about how I could see what she means, but how I also really wanted to push back against her argument, or rather, how I wanted to reframe her argument. I would argue that Lore Olympus does not romanticize the Persephone myth, yet it still does make a love story for Hades and Persephone. Specifically, I want to now turn my focus from the broader umbrella of reception theory to look at 4 key relationships that together build Lore Olympus into a unique story that develops a love connection between Persephone and Hades without forfeiting the intense mother-daughter bond that is central to the Homeric hymn to Demeter. First, I want to start by discussing Persephone's friendship and growing romantic relationship with Hades. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Hades forcefully snatches Persephone away to the underworld, and Persephone is described as unwilling, in Greek, aekusan. Yet Claudian's Seraptu Proserpinae tells another tale. Proserpina, Persephone, is led away to the underworld by Venus, Aphrodite, at Zeus's Jove's behest. Maurice Plattner's translation in the Loeb series says, quote, "To Venus he, Jove, thus unfolded the secrets of his heart. Goddess of Cythera, lead Ceres' Demeter's daughter," end quote. The main crux of these 2 versions of the myth are that Persephone did not voluntarily venture to the underworld, and Lore Olympus begins much the same way. Here we see Aphrodite's facial expression, reacting to a comment Hades makes about Persephone. Hades says, quote, "Honestly, I think she puts Aphrodite to shame," end quote. True to Aphrodite's jealous nature that we recognize from ancient mythology, Rachel Smythe reframed the Persephone myth through Aphrodite's manipulation in a more modernized sense. Instead of leading Persephone off to the underworld at her father's behest, Aphrodite instead uses her son Eros' help to hide a drunk Persephone away in Hades' car, as punishment to both of them for Hades' comment. Hades ends up unknowingly taking Persephone away to the underworld, but he safely returns her to the care of Artemis the very next day. This unusual meet-cute spawns a domino effect for the webtoon. Each event flows directly into the next, and the story remains centered on Persephone's own tale, even when mixing in other myths like those of Psyche and Eros. Hades is enamored with Persephone from the very beginning of Smythe's retelling of the myth, but he does not force Persephone into anything, and their friendship and more slowly their romantic relationship grows with each episode. One really unique facet of mythological receptions is that the stories are so well known that surprises are not very common, and Smythe takes the time not only to develop the budding romance between Hades and Persephone, but also looks ahead to what most readers already know. Persephone will become queen of the underworld. In about the middle of season 1 of Lore Olympus, the Fates share an important piece of knowledge saying, quote, "It is natural for a king to be curious about his future queen." This setup of what is to come keeps readers in a balance of known and unknown information. The myth will eventually pan out the way we expect it to, but the road to getting there is one that we haven't experienced before. One specific way that love grows between Hades and Persephone in other versions of the Persephone myth is through the villainification of Demeter. The simplest way to make the quote bad guy not bad is to reframe him through another's point of view. In this myth's case, Hades might still be the bad guy to an overprotective mother as he sweeps in and steals away the affections of a devoted daughter. After all, the Homeric hymn to Demeter is primarily a tale of Demeter's grief over the loss of her daughter. Yet, Smythe does not take this 180 approach in directly flipping a Hades villain for a Demeter villain. Persephone loves her mother dearly in Lore Olympus, but she also fears that her mother has protected her too much from the world. In episode 6 of the first season, we see one of Persephone's nightmares. In this one, her mother has gifted her with a beautiful greenhouse. But when Persephone turns around to thank her mother, she notices the greenhouse has no doors and is in fact a cage. This rose and thorn styled gift does paint Demeter in the light of an overprotective mother. But we also learn that there's much more depth to Demeter's protection in Lore Olympus that simply does not show up in other receptions. I recall reading one specific reception where Demeter was villainized as an extremely overprotective mother, Radiant Darkness by Emily Whitman. The deaths of mortals created by winter were purposeful on Demeter's part in order to manipulate Persephone into returning home. Demeter has more complex motives than Lore Olympus. Our first real glimpse at Demeter's control over Persephone's life comes when Persephone receives the TGOEM, the Goddesses of Eternal Maidenhood Scholarship. And she tries to keep Persephone at home rather than allowing her to move to Olympus for her studies, even as Artemis intervenes on Persephone's behalf. Demeter becomes defensive in her decision to keep Persephone at home, but we already know that Persephone made it to Olympus. Demeter wants to hide Persephone because she knows the truth. Persephone is a fertility goddess, and from the snippets of information that are suggested throughout the webtoon's course, we are learning that her powers are unfathomable and frightening to the Olympians. The underlying concept of Demeter's theory of fertility goddesses means that the immortal patriarch, in this case Zeus, can only be defeated through a son's control of a fertility goddess, which leads us to the particular god hinted at as the one who might be trying to use and abuse Persephone's powers, Apollo. With Demeter's overprotection being explained in specific terms, Lore Olympus needed to design a new antagonist for the myth, and Apollo quickly assimilates into that assigned role. Returning to Persephone's unwilling entrance into the underworld, Persephone's ancient myth in Latin is called, quote, the rape of Persephone, end quote. And it requires the trigger warning as one of many Greco-Roman myths that contain instances of sexual violence and rape. Lore Olympus does not remove this traumatic element from the myth, even while creating it into a love story. But Smythe completely shifts the narrative. Hades does not act as the perpetrator. Rather, Apollo, as an extremely narcissistic young Olympian, takes full advantage of Persephone, abusing her emotionally and sexually. Persephone's feelings toward Apollo, mainly terror and wrath, work to frame her relationship with Hades in vast contrast. Apollo's intense antagonism makes Hades' true care for Persephone all the clearer. Switching from characters most often focused on in the Persephone myth, I want to wrap up by highlighting a key character in Lore Olympus and his relationship to Persephone, the personification of love himself, Eros. Eros plays such an important role in Lore Olympus, and I think his part in Persephone's story in this retelling is crucial because he helps Persephone work through everything that happened with Apollo and her growing feelings for Hades. Coincidentally, he is also the one who helped Aphrodite set this whole Lore Olympus story in motion. Immediately after Persephone returns home to Artemis's house, Eros arrives to apologize. And his apology becomes quickly sidetracked because he senses Persephone's crush on Hades. Persephone and Eros' friendship grows quickly and stands strong throughout the course of Lore Olympus. Eros also becomes the one person that Persephone confides in about Apollo. Eros and Aphrodite have the ability to sense whether or not someone is a virgin. And Eros notes to Persephone that he can tell she isn't, making a note about the requirement for TGOEM. When Persephone bursts into tears, Eros uses his powers to see what happened. And he also then begins to cry on Persephone's behalf. He explains to Persephone that what Apollo did is rape, and that his repeated nagging did not allow for Persephone to consent. Eros helps Persephone to start working through her trauma, and he continues to be a firm friend and stand with her against Apollo's continued harassment. Eros, love, is a key figure in Lore Olympus. To resolve my stance on the debate of whether or not love can exist in the underworld, I want to emphasize that the most important facet of Lore Olympus remains the Persephone-centric storyline. We see how Persephone reacts to and navigates so many different relationships throughout the webtoon. Her friendship and romance with Hades, her complicated mother-daughter bond with Demeter, her repulsion towards her abuser Apollo, and her unique and steadfast friendship with Eros. The way in which Lore Olympus continually shifts and balances out these many relationships in Persephone's life creates the possibility for love to exist between Persephone and Hades, making a love story without causing any detriment to our understandings of the ancient tale. Thank you so much for listening.